I'd like to introduce you Diana Roig Sanz. She is research professor and coordinator of the Global Literary Studies Research Lab and at University Oberta de Catalunya. She is also the principal investigator of the ERC project, Social Networks of the Past, Mapping Hispanic and Lusophone Literary Modernity, 1898-1959, funded by the European Research Council. I think that we are waiting for a very interesting presentation by Diana. Please, you can start.
Okay, Spasiba, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I would like to thank you, Elizabeth Boer and the local committee for their invitation and for the hard work organizing this conference. So I'm going to share my screen and you should be seeing different slides all the time. So if something happened, just let me know. Can you see my screen now? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will speak around 50 minutes and then we can leave some time for the discussion if this is fine with you. Okay, now it's not moving. Okay. Now, okay. This is the outline that I prepared for today. So, and I will divide it in two main parts. The first one, it will be more theoretical and methodological around the term of big translation history. And then I will present you some examples of this approach through the case study that I'm currently working on my ERC project. This is one of the research paths that I'm following. So let's start. In the last 2 decades, computational tools have been used in the humanities and the social sciences to study patterns of cultural change, both in the present and in the past. While the main goal has been to measure culture in an innovative way, it has evolved differently among the wide range of disciplines that study the human condition at various university departments all over the world. At the same time, we are only starting to become fully aware of the potentials and pitfalls of using machine learning and artificial intelligence in the humanities and the social sciences. In the field of translation studies, digital research in the analysis of translation history remains scarce, and we are only beginning to understand how digital tools and quantification can be applied to the study of translated literature and literary translation flows. Statistical and quantitative approaches were already advanced 20 years ago with Johan Hilbron from the Netherlands and Giselle Sapiro in France, employing a quantitative approach to analyze a whole system of translation that has been propelled or constrained by the dynamics of global publishing and hierarchies between languages, which range, according to them, from the hypercentral, as in the case of English, to the semi-peripheral and peripheral languages. Anthony Pym also proposed using statistics and discussed the notion of cultural sovereignty as well as an alternative way of understanding the always problematic idea of border. Pym renewed translation history by focusing on cultural systems and on the people, translators, who embodied them, as did Andrew Chesterman, who proposed in 2009 translator studies as a discipline. Taking a cultural transfer perspective, Belgian scholars have likewise put forward the role of cultural mediators, as well as international and intracultural networks. All these works have been relevant to translation studies and to the sociology of translation, and have applied both quantitative and qualitative perspectives, but they did not yet use machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they leave ample room for further discussion of the different ways of quantifying histories of translation, ways that would allow us to move between different scales, local, national, regional, global, between geographical spaces and through time, and from small to large data sets. At this juncture, we need to consider which aspects of translation history can be measured and with which new tools, data sources, and methods. What does it mean to represent translation history with data? What are the opportunities and pitfalls of computationally analyzing translation flows and large cultural data sets? How can we combine quantification, the statistical study of literary translation in an historical period, and data visualization on a larger scale with qualitative methods, including textual analysis of selected translations? And how should we combine the analysis of larger patterns with the analysis of agents of translation or cultural mediators? These are some of the questions that we can pose today. And I will go now to the second section of this lecture, trying to explain the concept of big translation history that I've been working on. And I will maybe ask you if you can silence your microphone because I can hear some noises. Yeah, I don't know, Leonid, if, yeah, thank you very much. At the intersection of translation and literary studies, publishing history, media studies, and computational technologies, this lecture encourages reflection on the theoretical and methodological basis of translation historiography, proposing the term Big Translation History, BTH, from now on, which I define as a translation history that can be analyzed computationally. In my view, BTH represents a breakthrough in the sense that it challenges previous research on the circulation of translation. There is still some noise. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, okay, better now because I think it's not me, yeah. So I was saying that in my view, BTH represents a breakthrough in the sense that it challenges previous research on the circulation of translations. The comparison of data sets and transnational translation flows on a scale that was previously unimaginable. This means both geographically and over time. Also reveals both the limits of BTH and the strengths of rewriting translation history through digital archives and metadata. A general hypothesis is that one of the main possibilities offered by BTH is to help decentralize translation history and literary and cultural history in a broad sense by breaking with national historiographies in translation. This might be particularly significant for researchers working on periods in which borders have changed, those dealing with translated literature in the diaspora, and those working on translations of regional literatures, such as Flemish, and non-state literatures as with Catalan. BTH can also help us identify centers of production, the transit of translations, and connectivity between actors. BTH is therefore not only a methodological tool to show patterns of translation, the centrality or not of specific translators or translated authors, women among them, or how translations are organized in different ways, but it can also contribute to conceptualize global approaches to literature and translation history. As I understand it, BTH can be grounded on three fundamentals: large-scale research, geographical and chronological, massive data, understood using a two-pronged approach involving both big data and little data, and drawing on a wide range of often heterogeneous and non-structured sources. And third, the use of computational techniques as part of the research process and for the production of knowledge, rather than helping only with visualization. I understand little data as involving both small numbers and data that is heterogeneous in the sense that it comes from different sources and has not been always homogenized and structured. The application of any or all 3 of the proposed fundamentals can elucidate intercultural relations that have been overshadowed or remain unknown. For example, indicators of the emergence, decline, or lack of intercultural relations, and patterns of cultural change in the circulation of translations. With a relational and agent-driven approach, my research focuses on the possibilities that quantitative analysis opens in the study of translated literature, whether it's circulated or not, and the roles played by translators, publishers, critics, literary agents, institutes for the promotion of national literatures, and book fairs. While I anticipate complementing this research with qualitative microtextual analysis, in this lecture, I elaborate on the macrotextual and contextual approach. Certainly, there is still much controversy regarding the definition of big data and how big big data is. But there is also much consensus regarding the fact that our understanding of big data can vary from field to field, and that having the right data is more important than the size of the data. As Christine Borman notes, data are big or little in terms of what can be done with them, what insights they can reveal, and the scale of the analysis. Thus, the conceptual framework that I propose with BTH draws on big data and little data, distant reading, cultural analytics, machine learning, data mining, and artificial intelligence. It's not my purpose to discuss all these perspectives, but to show how they can be applied to translation history. Let us quickly remind some landmarks. Distant reading is obviously associated with Franco Moretti and the work done at the Stanford Literary Lab that has catalyzed a revolution in literary studies and beyond. Lev Manovich defined cultural analytics as the analysis of massive cultural datasets and flows using computational and visualization techniques. In my research, I see cultural analytics as nourishing BTH, since translation is also a cultural practice, and we also use machine learning and visualizations to explore our data, even though my main concern is with text and not images. Finally, Tim Hitchcock proposed the term big history in the context of studying history computationally. This notion has inspired my proposal of BTH as a new research avenue that can apply the main principles of Moretti's, Manovich, and Hitchcock's work, all the while remaining aware of the potential and pitfalls of the approach. In this respect, it behoves us to think critically about our methodology and to ask, for example, how should we collect data? How do we measure how representative it is? How can we reflect the way the data was gathered? And how collaborative is BTH or any of the research you are undertaking at large scale? BTH projects already belong to a new generation of researchers that it's not the same generation of Moretti, for example, who are aware of the dangers of reinforcing previous ideas by using only readily available sources. The empires were very good at creating data, but we remain ignorant of much data that is not available and of voices that have not yet been heard. The digital turn has heightened interest in several disciplines that could benefit from dealing with large-scale data and a transnational approach. But these distant reading perspectives have not evolved in the same way across all geographical and scholarly contexts, and we have to be very aware of this. Likewise, the cultural data sets that researchers have at their disposal and their skills and levels of awareness regarding the Eurocentric or Anglo-American points of view inherent in these data sets can also vary. Data infrastructure and policies for open data sharing can also differ. Finally, researchers have tended to prioritize the literature of a specific periods, for example, 19th century or medieval texts, like in the valuable work by David Risley, and we have seen some examples in this conference, specific genres, like the novel or novellas, as in the panel I was chairing yesterday, and data sets from the Anglo-American, French, and to a lesser extent, German literary and cultural worlds. In what follows, I will briefly give you some examples of the use of data-driven approaches in a range of projects and disciplines to better frame similar endeavors in the translation history field. The Stanford Literary Lab and the Cultures of Knowledge project in Oxford paved the way in digital literary history. In recent years, Ted Underwood, Andrew Piper in McGill, Montreal, and Richard So and Hoyt Long have also contributed to the cultural analytics turn in the study of literature and culture. Quantification has also been very relevant to digital history and the study of memory in the digital age, as well as to the development of a social network approach to intellectual history, as in the case of Martin Grandjean in Lausanne, or the recognition of faces in historical photographs by Martin During in Luxembourg. The possibilities of a digital history of periodicals has also drawn the attention of a significant group of scholars, my team and I among them, but also Marianne van Remoltel in Belgium and Rocío Ortuño in Antwerpen, working with periodicals from the Philippines. And yesterday also in my panel, there was another colleague working with Hebrew. While a very interesting gender perspective has been taken regarding female representation through the analysis of faces extracted from historical journals. The digital history approach has also contributed to other fields, including art history and initiatives by Malte Hagener in Marburg, Daniela Treveri in Oxford, and Ainamar Clariana in Barcelona, who apply digital humanities and actor network theory to film studies. When it comes to translation history, translation studies has an established tradition of research based on corpus analysis. Related work has also been conducted in machine translation, and translation history itself has already experienced the rapid growth of small databases, often related to the translation of a national literature into other languages. For example, German translations into Italian, or book translations from Dutch, and in Turkey there are other colleagues making similar endeavors. Translations conducted over a specific period, such as in the case of French Romantic translations into Spanish, or translations published by a specific publisher, as with the magazine and Argentinian publishing house Sur. However, while these are valuable works, these databases often fall short of enabling users to conduct automatic or relational searches, because translation databases are often designed for manual or individual rather than collaborative research. Work based on translation databases also often lacks reflection on how we might create knowledge beyond providing a list of historical translations. Some translation catalogs offer relevant print media documents as PDFs, but such format precludes metadata extraction and reuse, both of which would allow for comparisons with other databases. Despite this fact, there is no doubt that in the last few years, translation history has been driven by new research projects applying data mining, data collection and cleaning, visualization, computational analysis, and interpretation. Here in this slide, you have some of the first endeavors. The ERC project that I have the honor to lead, but also works by Asrafi on publishing in Iran, Andre Wiemer from Prague on peripheral relations between Swedish, Norwegian, and Czech, but also the Beltrans project led by Rainer Melaerts and Elke Brems on the analysis of intra-Belgian literary translations since 1970. There might be more, of course, but this is just a sample of them. Within this general context, research projects applying a BTH perspective can promote larger-scale analysis of translations, considering not only translated text, but also all related metadata. Thus, a BTH approach can allow us to focus on, first, the analysis of translations from a textual point of view by applying, for example, topic modeling, and second, the study of the material conditions of book production and circulation to analyze literary translation flows, networks of publishers, authors and translated works, the role of given languages and the agents involved, and the uncovering of creative networks of agents of translations. This will certainly help us to document historical patterns of translation and cultural change. For example, the lack or presence of the translator's name in translated books or translated literature in journals, which may show the professionalization of the field, as well as local, national, regional, and global milestones in the history of translation and publishing. I maintain that metadata offers great potential in such analysis, and note how bibliographic data can be extracted from library catalogs, archives, databases such as WOCAT, national library catalogs worldwide, digital collections such as the HathiTrust Digital Library, and newer sources such as Wikipedia, Wikidata, and VIAF, the Virtual International Authority file. On a different level, I'm going to jump now into other issues that are relevant to any project on BTH and in general to any project working at a larger scale. First, the multiple scales and layers of data collection and analysis. In a similar vein to Freytag and von Oppen regarding the study of globalizing processes in the Global South, I consider different scales in the analysis of translation developments, since these processes cannot be seen as separately and exclusively local, national, regional, or global, but can instead be observed at the intersection of multiple scales in which transnational actors with multiple roles and transnational networks may also be involved. The use of BTH may examine neglected aspects of multiple histories of translation that are not always framed within national and monolingual historiographies and fixed borders. BTH can also enable us to unearth understudied networks, transnational actors, cultural mediators, transnational translation dynamics in less established cultural capitals, and the relationship between connectivity and intercultural exchange at diverse scale. Furthermore, we might retrace global translation zones and shed new light on the too often labeled innovative centers and imitative peripheries. A review of the existing literature and translation history and the history of books and publishing shows the clear predominance of single monographs focused on an individual translation, translator, publisher, or a specific period of translation. However, there is not much of a tradition when it comes to studying the big picture or multiple layers. And in the slide, I offer two examples of Spanish histories of translation that are mainly focused on Spanish, and they forget or hardly forget other languages in Spain, such as Catalan, Galician, or Basque. The following topic I would like to highlight is the dimension of space and time. The spatial turn has placed space and movement at the core of many current challenges in a wide range of fields, pushing translation historians to review classic dichotomies such as center and periphery, dominant and dominated, global and local, and north and south. A consensus on the significant role of Southern Europe and non-European regions in modern cultural processes has been established. However, we still need source-based empirical research and appropriate tools and methods to historically analyze their connections and roles in specific periods and disciplines between spaces and over time. I thus call for a flexible periodization of both the corpus and the spaces of comparison. Transnational approaches are sometimes difficult because they have to do with specific national histories that may differ, and a long durée account in broader terms of how translations and translators circulate or not over time and beyond borders. This would mean focusing on the longer term and taking a broad view of historical landmarks of translation in large-scale spaces, as I tried to do with Latin America, Spain, and Portugal through the comparison of metadata from the catalogs of different national libraries. Likewise, we have often been told that literary translation flows between the so-called peripheral cultures occurred thanks to the mediation of central languages, but BTH may question these channels of transmission. In the case of Georgian literature, to give an example close to our host organizers, and this case is not an exception, the most translated titles of contemporary literature were first translated to other peripheral or semi-peripheral languages like Croatian, Dutch, or Italian. As you can see in this visualization, Anna Virikachvili, one of my PhD students, has identified active translation flows with central languages like German, French, or English, but also with East European and Caucasian languages such as Ukrainian or Armenian. In this respect, one of the greatest challenges that we have ahead is to encourage a decentralized and non-Western and Eurocentric cultural perspective that enables researchers to engage in larger accounts. Let's see if now, yeah. My third point has to do with the incompleteness and inherent bias of available data. It's worth recognizing that the sources and catalogs available to us are imperfect, given the genealogy, evolution, and expansion of cataloging practices and standards. In this sense, researchers in BTH share to a certain extent the challenges faced by other historians when it comes to working with partial sources, pushing researchers to find ways to fill in the gaps. In this respect, the valuable sources I have mentioned above do not draw enough attention to the differences between geographical contexts or the lack of or weak representativity of sources and digital archives that many research face. If we look now at the issue of the digital and knowledge divide, greater awareness of how and from where we produce knowledge should help us realize the unequal representation of university departments from the global south or other parts of the world, such as Russia, Central Asia, or the Arabic world. This limitation can certainly introduce many bias and reinforce the apparent centrality of some translations or translators, indeed of reducing the knowledge divide and making knowledge more diverse and equal. For example, the Journal for Cultural Analytics boasts a focus on cultural equality, but most of the papers and datasets currently being published still espouse an Anglo-American approach. The same goes for digitization by Google Books, which mainly involves books in the English language. Another issue is the relationship between qualitative and quantitative analysis. There has been some resistance to using quantification and scientific methods in the study of culture and translation. However, as I will try to show you in the next section, a BTH approach allows us at this stage to answer quantitative questions. For example, how many books are literary and how many books are not? What percentage of literary titles were reused? Or how many literary books were published by place or time period. Quantitative analysis will also enable researchers to identify the most common languages and genres, but also the translator, an often neglected field in most databases. Let's talk now a bit about interdisciplinarity that came in the first keynote lecture, data sharing and open science. The ethics of open preservation and publication force us to rethink both the field and the profession. What kind of reputation does digital scholarship have? Certainly, we need standards for digital scholarship, and we push for their development. Digital translation historians must support discussions on methodology, ethics, the cost and funding of large projects and their sustainability. But what infrastructure do we have at our disposal? How do we maintain it? BTH is not established yet, and there is an urgent need to foster interdisciplinarity and data sharing, as well as to promote training and the use of different sources that can be increasingly combined. Interdisciplinarity will be crucial if we want BTH to be accepted as part of mainstream translation history, and the same goes for other disciplines working at larger scale. New sources develop also new standards. At the same time, we also should respect the standards of our discipline. We need to get to know each other's projects and reflect upon our limitations. BTH can be used to visualize translation flows and produce new knowledge, but it can also build research infrastructure and new data. And even though there are big differences between academic cultures and open data policies of institutions from different countries, collaboration is fundamental, not just for technical support, but for encouraging different ways of thinking among different disciplines. Data practices vary enormously across disciplines and fields, and we need structures that we can keep over the long term. If we can train translation historians in new methodologies, our thinking will be transformed, and new research questions and answers will emerge. Now I will present my case study, but just let me check the time. Yeah, that's fine. So, what is this? Is this a new planet? A funny face? How do you feel if I tell you that this image corresponds to all books gathered at the Spanish National Library in Madrid? This is the correct answer. This graph represents the whole book's catalog. If we zoom in the green area, you can see Don Quixote's constellation, which means the network of translators, authors, publishers, translations, rewritings, and so on. So I won't go in, I don't have time to go in detail, but this is a work that we are trying to analyze more in depth. So I started with this example to present an empirical case study based on the analysis of the distribution and circulation of translated literature in the Spanish-speaking book market, which means Spain and Latin America, between 1898 and 1945. This period is bounded by events of historical significance: the loss of Cuba by the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War in 1898, and the end of the Second World War in 1945. To this end, my colleague Laura Folica and I have worked with the catalog of the National Library of Spain, which is available for open access. Its catalog counts around 28 million volumes, and the digital library was launched in 2008. We need, however, to be aware of certain limitations in the catalog. For instance, the digitization of the catalog introduced changes or bias in relation to the previous analog catalog. Furthermore, there is missing or non-homogeneous data in the records because the records are not always filled exhaustively by archivists. Finally, we must note that unofficial and underground translations are not registered in this catalog because they do not necessarily have a legal deposit number, and their circulation follows other paths, as in the case of the Samizdat, for example, that you may also know. Thus, we cannot assume that all books that were published between 1898 and 1945 in Spain are recorded in its catalog. Furthermore, since I aim to develop a relational analysis of the Spanish-speaking translation field, I also need to compare the datasets from Latin American national libraries in countries such as Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, countries where the translation market grew significantly at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. This research moves toward transnational studies that take linguistic diversity within nations into account, alongside the transnational character of certain languages. Then, general categories such as Iberoamerica and Latin America do not necessarily imply the existence of homogeneous or monolingual identity. And of course, I'm also thinking in all the indigenous languages in Latin America. Undoubtedly, extracting knowledge from library catalogs is difficult because of their unstructured and heterogeneous archives. This is the case when conducting large-scale work with various national libraries from Latin America, as its libraries rely on disparate ways of indexing their material, digitization and preservation policies, and budgets. For this reason, and despite the great potential for book history and translation history, these resources remain underexploited. Indeed, if we attempt to measure literary production over time, we will find ourselves confronted with a lack of publication records that could point to publishing activity, such as the International Standard Book Number, which was adopted internationally in 1970, but does not gather information for our period of study. Using a large corpus of digitized text can provide a quantitative description of cultural trends. Google Ngram allows us to find the frequency of terms over time within the corpus of digitized books on Google Books, and the meta-catalog WorldCat, which aggregates information from various library archives, enables the simultaneous consultation of content from each archive. Even though Google Books and WorldCat present some methodological problems, such as inconsistent data and a lack of genre identifiers, we can begin to describe production in a general way. However, the Spanish National Library catalog offers more detailed information than we could obtain from WorldCat. For example, we identified many errors in WorldCat in relation to Spanish authors. They don't distinguish when there is a book published in Catalan or a book published in Spanish. They homogenize that they are both Spanish, and they don't distinguish the different languages in the country. After automatically extracting this data, we clean it in order to establish consistent categories for the following fields: author, author dates, here author, author dates, author role, translator, preface writer, target text, publisher, publisher place, book date, book place, language, original language, language of translation, and the universal decimal classification that was very useful because this is the code that archivists use to classify books. As far as the methodological challenges are concerned, any research working with data from similar sources may find that the more relevant a publication, the less consistent the data. In contrast, information on minor or less renowned works is more trustworthy, with only 1 or 2 entries in the catalog. For instance, Don Quixote boasts 4,500 entries in the Spanish National Library, but how can we recognize that all these entries refer to the same book? A number of tools may be used to measure the degree of proximity between different entries and titles, and we have used a variety of techniques such as regular expressions, a sequence of characters defining a search pattern, Levenshtein distance, the minimum number of single character insertions, deletions or substitutions required to change one word into another, phonetic similarity, this means comparing factors such as pronunciation rather than spelling, and n-grams, from which probabilistic models for predicting the next item in a sequence can be generated. Other types of metadata can also present problems. Oftentimes, the names of the publishers are inconsistent, and place and date can also be missing, perhaps more so in the case of the publications by short-lived and smaller publishing houses. In contrast, the bigger the publishing house, the better the information in the catalog. As part of our cleaning, we normalize publishing house names, eliminating different endings such as comb, Thea, Cope, Ed, e hijos, which means and sons, y sus amigos, and their friends, hermanos, siblings, and so on. But this does not resolve this problem entirely, as some publishers are registered under different names, including in this case, for example, Compañía Iberoamericana de Publicaciones, that is registered in multiple names. Places of publication were also missing in some cases, and in others need to be distinguished from the location of the printer as opposed to the publisher of a book. In addition, we needed to standardize names of cities such as New York, Nueva York, and NY, or Mexico, DF, and Ciudad de Mexico. Then we also have to face the unification of names. And in this slide, you have the example of Dostoevsky and the multiple ways of writing this name and its surname. So that this is another important challenge that we have to face. Another one has to do with the literary genre, which is only occasionally filled in the catalog. In the Spanish National Library catalog, the genre is based on the Universal Decimal Classification that I was mentioning before, a bibliographic classification for all branches of knowledge. The UDC classification is not always given in the catalog. However, in our database, we could find 45% of entries that have this information. It's also worth emphasizing that genre is an arbitrary and historical category that changes with time. For example, the biography was considered a literary genre at the beginning of the 20th century in Spain, and many authors wrote biographies as a literary genre. Another especially relevant challenge for me involves establishing whether a book is a translation or not. In general, the label translation is not explicit in the catalog, but may be deduced from other more reliable fields. For example, language code of original and language code of text, or language of the catalog object, as illustrated by several entries for Gustave Flaubert. As you can see also in the slide, we have the original language, French, and then the target language, Spanish. It's also challenging to define the author's gender, which is not mentioned in the catalog. In this case, the simplest and most effective approach would be to match the list of authors against an existing authorities database, such as the Virtual International Authority file, VIAF, that I was mentioning before, which provides data on gender as well as author nationality and usual language of expression, or to use information from the Spanish National Statistics Institute to distinguish male and female names. And I wanted to point out other ways that you can explore, such as the Wiki project, Women in Red, Missing Articles by Occupation. Here you have an excerpt regarding women translators, but you can find all professions there. A new challenge revolves around the uncertain dates in the catalog. In this slide, you can see how, for example, regular peaks at the beginning of each decade, 900s, 910, and so on, reflecting imprecise dates recorded for many entries where the archivists, they didn't know the exact date of the book. Once cleaned, the database we derived from the Spanish National Library contain 260,000 entries, almost, of which almost 40,000 are identified as literature, which is the field we are focused on. Then you also have almost 90,000 contributors, which means persons who have contributed as authors, translators, compilers, prologue authors, illustrators, or in other roles. You also have almost 63,000 publishers, publishing houses, and printers. And in order to test the reliability of our database, we explore some basic features by means of SQL queries. Note that for this step of quality control, we propose general and quantitative queries, not to ask groundbreaking new questions, but rather to ask simple ones, to which answers are already available from previous research, which allowed us to confirm the consistency of our database. And this is a very important step. These basic questions include, for example, when were literary books produced? Which cities were home to the bulk of literary publishing between 1898 and 1945 in Spanish, Catalan, Galician, and Basque, according to the Spanish National Library? What languages were most translated from? Who were the most translated foreign authors during the period in question? Or how do publishing houses feature in the network? Here you have the distribution of literature books by dates, and we can see that during the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, the production and the publication of books dropped. Obviously, you also have here other preliminary data that shows the most important cities for the Spanish-speaking publishing market. And then you have Madrid and Barcelona, also Buenos Aires. But it draws our attention the position of Mexico that you can see in a farther place. So this means that we have to compare our data in the Spanish National Library with the data in the Mexican National Library. And this is what we are doing to compare and to cross all the metadata that we have from the different national libraries to find results that are more and more consistent and reliable. In these slides, you can also see the Spanish-speaking publishing market outside the Spanish-speaking world. And then you can find that some books were translated and published in the Spanish language in the States, but also in other countries and also in Russia. For languages, the most frequent source language was French, reflecting the Francophilia of the time, followed by English, Italian, German, and Russian. The analysis of publishing houses can also shed light into potential translating publishing houses of the time, which is also very relevant because we can distinguish those who didn't publish translations and those who certainly did. Finally, regarding the most translated authors, we check which of these authors wrote in a language other than Spanish. The 100 most frequent authors in the Spanish National Library include 15 foreign authors who are, in descending order of entries, Shakespeare, Verne, Dumas, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Balzac, Dickens, Salieri, Edgar Wallace, Oscar Wilde, François Maurois, Goethe, Victor Hugo, Queiroz, and Gorky. Let me now finish with a couple of examples regarding translations in journals, which, as I told you, I'm not going to focus on today, but I wanted to show you some examples because this is also a part of our research and we are doing the same work that I showed you, but regarding large digital archives of periodicals. In this case, it's a small sample. It's a journal published in Barcelona, in Catalan, La Revista, and 2 others in Argentina. And I cannot go now in the notes, so you will have to believe me, but all of these notes is the place of birth of all the authors that were translated in these journals. And in this case, we can see the contemporaneity of these translations in these journals, which breaks with this idea that I was mentioning before between innovative centers and imitative peripheries. And indeed, in the Spanish-speaking world, many important translations were translated into Spanish before other languages. For example, it appears an excerpt of the Metamorphose by Kafka in a Spanish journal which is called Revista de Occidente, and this translation is previous to the French or English one, and the same goes for the completed works by Freud, for example. Another nice example of what we can do with BTH has to do with the place and language of publication and origin of Portuguese-speaking authors in different journals. For example, we can see different practices of translation when we see if these authors are translated or they are published in their original language. Here you have 3 different journals: Sur, Buenos Aires, Alfar, Montevideo, and Boletín Titicaca, that was published in Peru. And we can see that those Portuguese-speaking authors published in Peru were not translated, they were published in original language, and those who were published in Sur, they were all translated into Spanish, and in the case of Alfar, they were half translated because this journal started in Galicia and then moved to Montevideo. So you can see that when the journal was already established in Galicia, they published in original language because Portuguese and Galician are very close. And when they moved to Uruguay, they translate. Here you have a similar example regarding the translation and publication of Portuguese-speaking writers in these 3 journals in Spain. And you can see in the case of La Revista in Barcelona, that was published in Catalan, how they all translate all these Portuguese-speaking writers, because this was very good to build a literary model for Catalan language that was still built at that time. In the case of Alfar, as I said before, in Galicia, they don't translate, they publish in original language. And in the case of La Gaceta Literaria in Madrid, they publish 50% in Portuguese and the other 50% in translation. So, in short, I have presented findings based on quantitative queries in the database regarding translation flows and the time and place of publication of different translations as a good way to test the reliability of our database. These findings are consistent with the consensus in specialized literature on publishing history. In a slightly more innovative move, I have also proposed the use of graphs to explore the relationships between foreign authors, translators, publishers, and books, and the big translation history as a conceptual framework. There is no doubt that today many researchers around the world are already working on the study of cultural phenomena on a large scale and from a transnational perspective. Translation studies, and more precisely translation history, are currently being changed by data mining and data-driven approaches. I have proposed BTH as a new interdisciplinary field of study that allows us to analyze large translation datasets and flows using computational and visualization techniques and taking into account what I was mentioning before between little and big data, small numbers or not. I have also included a case study to illustrate some of the challenges we still face. In doing so, I have striven to shed light on the following issues. First, methodologies for the analysis of translation history on a large scale. Second, methodological challenges and pitfalls in the collection, analysis, and visualization of data and metadata from a significant number of translations registered in the catalog of the National Library of Spain, but also in the catalog of other national libraries from Latin America. Third, the complementarity between quantitative and qualitative approaches in the analysis of the big picture, as well as in the study of the agents involved. And fourth, the challenges of historical depth when applying cross-border research and using large-scale data that touches upon multiple translation histories and translation processes encompassing various parts of the world. As noted, large-scale research requires quantitative analysis that cannot always reach exhaustivity when using a distant reading approach. This large scale means that researchers must be selective, but they are also constrained by what is available. In that respect, the translation data sets that we have at our disposal are in some cases small or otherwise lacking, and this should also reinforce our awareness of the reliability of our results. To be sure, our findings are often indicative rather than exhaustive, and the data can also introduce some bias depending on the chosen sources and their accessibility and completeness. Thus, it's worth recognizing that the sources and catalogs available are imperfect, and that their construction always involves a wide range of human criteria and factors. Alongside the relative lack of archives, we also must face the problem of specific national criteria in the building of the catalog. As I have also shown, we do not yet have common standards for the quantification of culture, nor for the quantification of translations, for that matter. However, if we establish an honest, rigorous methodological process, the knowledge we can generate will prove more significant than ever before. This will certainly allow us to recover singular and representative histories, microhistories of translations and mediators, as well as to study the big picture and the multiple layers and relations that are behind it. As I stated above, I'm convinced that one of the main possibilities offered by the analysis of PTH is to have decentralized translation history and literary and cultural history in a broad sense, while breaking with national historiographies in translation. And let me finish with a final point. A decolonized and non-Eurocentric approach should go hand in hand with a decentralization on the academic level too, which will allow us to minimize the long and intertwined history of colonialism and the struggles of Anglo-American and Parisian universities to add their valuable perspectives, interpretations, and specific theoretical frameworks to future literature and to a current debate that is not closed. In this sense, data science and data-driven approaches seem to be very, very exciting research avenues. Thank you very much for your attention, Spasiba, and that's all. And I have added some bibliography. This is the works we have already published, in case you are interested, some self-team promotion, let's say. And then this is going to come out in 2022 in the Greuter, and some bibliography. We also have an agreement of collaboration with Hanno Erlicher from the University of Tübingen in the case of the journals, but today I was not talking, or not mainly talking about this. And then more bibliography, yeah, and some acknowledgements to some members of my team, Laura Folik and Wenceslav Ikov, and also to Andrei Beamer and Laura, with whom I chaired the Big Translation History panel and the use of data mining and big data approaches before of the pandemics in South Africa. And the drawings belong to Blanche Ellis. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm done.